Enterococcus as a whole, it seems like it is kind of like a hatchery problem. It's a common contaminant in the hatchery, in dead embryos in hatcheries. So we've been following it there, and it makes sense because it's one of the dominant commensals in the poultry gut microbiota. However, there have emerged these pathogenic strains that are physically able to translocate the gut through a mechanism that's more or less unknown and cause a sepsis. And then the paralytic form of the disease is when they come back out in this spinal lesion and cause a compressive spinal lesion that paralyzes the birds. So that pathogenesis has always fascinated me.
Welcome to the Poultry Podcast Show. Today I'm here with Grayson Walker. Welcome to the podcast, Grayson.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm really excited to have a chat with you today about some of the different topics of how you're involved with poultry. But first, I want to hear, how did you get into chickens? How did you make poultry your path?
Yeah, that's like one of my favorite questions ever to ask anybody in this field, because it's never the same answer. It's always like this off the wall zigzag type of journey, but it does have some common themes. So I grew up, and the first theme is like, I didn't grow up around poultry, or I didn't do poultry as a kid or whatever. That's me. I grew up in Western North Carolina. Most of the poultry production is concentrated in like the eastern part of the state. So I didn't grow up really around poultry, but I always knew that I wanted to be a veterinarian, right? That's like another common theme. So my goal was to go to NC State University and be a veterinarian. So fast forward to when I got to NC State, I wanted to kind of diversify my vet school application in undergraduate. And I started working in the lab of Dr. John Brake as an undergraduate researcher. And I loved it. He was an incredible mentor to me. And I just loved the research. He ran a nutritional physiology lab, and I was more interested in, like, obviously diseases of poultry. And when I told him that, he's like, well, I have a project looking at this feed additive control approach for salmonella. So I started on that as an undergraduate, and then that turned into a master's thesis. So I stayed for my master's degree in his lab. I loved it so much. But I still kind of always had questions about diseases and host pathogen interactions. So that's when I stumbled upon the opportunity to do a combined DVM PhD degree at North Carolina State University. So I've got my PhD in infectious diseases there, and I'm currently finishing vet school right now. So it's been a really fun ride. So again, no interest in poultry, hardcore interest in poultry. Go back to vet school, still keeping that interest in poultry, and then focusing a little bit more on like the nitty gritty of bacterial pathogens that we deal with in poultry. It's been a fun ride.
A worldwide leader in animal nutrition, Adiceo's portfolio of products includes methionine, the full range of vitamins, enzymes, organic selenium, probiotics, mycotoxin management strategies, and palatability products. With such a diverse offering, Adiceo supports its customers with a broad range of expertise, tools, and services to help them maintain a competitive advantage. Adiceo, fueling predictable profits. To learn more, visit Adiceo at www.adiceo.com.
Gosh, you love school. Yep. I can tell. You've spent quite a lot of time there. So for some of the people that might be interested in that path, I know the DVM PhD programs can vary, but can you just describe, I know some programs that do 2 years of vet school, do the PhD sandwich in the middle, do 2 years of vet school, and some have you do them simultaneously. What does your program look like? Yeah,
you nailed it. That's how NC State does it. It's basically 1 year of lab rotations, 2 years of vet school, then you come out and the PhD, the bulk of it is sandwiched in the middle, and then you come back into vet school, entirely new class. the whole 9 yards. So about the quickest you can do it at NC State is 7 years. And I'm on that track to finish in like that 7 year time frame. So I started in 2017, the vet school portion.
Yeah.
That being said, there's a lot of blurred lines there. I feel like I've been doing my PhD in the background the whole time I was in the vet school portion. And then now that I'm finished with my PhD, I'm still doing a lot of research, especially in my clinical year. I've scheduled a lot of externships that revolve around research pertaining to like mostly stuff that kind of spawned in during my PhD work, and also trying to wrap up some projects from that too. So it's a really flexible program, and I really enjoyed it a lot.
Gosh, that sounds really cool. But I have to ask, so from the time when you started your PhD to going back to your last few years of vet school, it's a different group of people. I mean, fashion-wise, it's got to be completely different than when you started, right?
Especially the way it worked out for me, because I joined a class that kind of started during the pandemic. So they didn't really know each other and I didn't know them. So I assimilated quite well. And just like in the first class I've joined, I've made some really good friends. So I kind of like to think of it as kind of double dipping. Like, anytime you graduate from any degree program, you have like a cohort of people who become your colleagues. And instead of 100 of those, I get 200 of those, I guess, is one way to look at it. Glass half full.
Oh, it's a lot of new names to remember too. And but that sounds like a really neat way.
On and off with the people, the research, the veterinary curriculum, which is completely different from like doing a master's or a PhD in any kind of poultry related discipline.
Oh gosh, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the diseases that you've been focusing on and why? I mean, some of them are obvious. Salmonella is obvious, right? But maybe there are some other reasons to focus on some of the other diseases or interesting things that you found during your research.
Yeah, sure. So salmonella is how I cut my teeth in poultry research, I guess, and using like a feed additive control approach. Like I'd describe it as an on-farm intervention control approach to salmonella. And that was really fun. I used basically a yeast-derived feed additive and looked at it. We had the kind of a unique setup at NC State. We had a fully vertically integrated research operation, which I think is cool because that kind of mirrors how the industry works. So we had rotation of broiler breeder flocks. I was involved in the management of those. We had an on-site hatchery, and then we had several broiler houses, and we even had a processing plant on site. So we were literally able to take our research from the breeder level to the broiler level, all the way to like the processing step, which I thought was really cool because, as we know, salmonella is like this insidious pathogen that like hides out in like very different aspects of the poultry production chain. So to be able to follow that during my master's degree was really cool. And of course, I can't forget the feed mill. The feed mill is an important component of that vertically integrated research operation at NC State as well. So that was awesome. I really got involved in the management of broiler breeders, which isn't something people really have the opportunity to get exposed to very often. And to be able to follow that from the parent level to the progeny was really neat. That's kind of how I got my interest in the epidemiology side of things. And my time at vet school started with a little project where I simply just like kind of genotyped my different salmonella isolates I had collected in this research operation over the years. And then when I discovered some of these molecular tools to characterize pathogens, I got really interested in that. So Dr. Luke Borst was my mentor for my PhD and at the vet school. He has made his name in the world of poultry with Enterococcus cecorum research. And although I've kind of picked up some of those leftover projects now, my PhD research was more on an observation he had made way back when he was in vet school. And that was that Enterococcus, not necessarily Enterococcus cecorum, but other species of Enterococcus, Faecalis, PCM, are often co-isolated with pathogenic E. coli. And I had dealt with colibacillosis, which is the disease caused by avian pathogenic E. coli, some in my master's degree, and I was really interested in that. So my PhD focused on kind of these polymicrobial interactions of E. coli and Enterococcus, and how those two pathogens together might enhance the virulence, potentiate E. coli and colibacillosis and whatnot. So I often like to say, you could write a PhD dissertation on pathogen to pathogen interactions, host pathogen interactions, like the immunology that's involved with that. It was super broad, but it was super fun. And I really learned a lot about, some pathogens other than Salmonella that are a huge problem for the poultry industry globally. Yeah. And here lately, I've been doing a little bit more Enterococcus cecorum research. And that one is, for those who don't know, the causative agent of kinkyback or enterococcal spondylitis in broiler production, which is a paralytic disease of later production.
I was just going to ask you, could you describe some of the things that happen with the different Enterococcus issues? I know there's a few different pathogens within that category.
Yeah.
They're not always on top of people's heads because they're not always foodborne pathogens, right? They cause other issues.
Exactly, yeah. And I kind of group these broadly into like enteric pathogens. And I always like to remind people with enteric pathogens, like sometimes they're commensals and then they're pathogenic strains. So that's very true with E. coli. That's also true with Enterococcus. And just as an example, it's a pretty common probiotic that, as I understand, is supplemented in the feed, different strains of Enterococcus. So it's a genus that comprises multiple species. The two that are probably of most concern with poultry are Enterococcus faecalis and Enterococcus cecorum. So Enterococcus faecalis causes a disease called amyloid arthropathy, and we've kind of got a project going investigating the molecular epidemiology with that, but that's entirely new to me. I've focused more on it as like an agent in sepsis and septicemic infections in poultry. And it's what I looked at it in the context of how it interacts with E. coli to make those infections more severe. As we learn more about Enterococcus as a whole, it seems like it is kind of like a hatchery problem. It's a common contaminant in the hatchery, in dead embryos in hatcheries. So we've been following it there, and it makes sense because it's one of the dominant commensals in the poultry gut microbiota. However, there have emerged these pathogenic strains that are physically able to translocate the gut through a mechanism that's more or less unknown and cause a sepsis. And then the paralytic form of the disease is when they come back out in this spinal lesion and cause a compressive spinal lesion that paralyzes the birds. So that pathogenesis has always fascinated me, and it fascinated Dr. Borst too. He's a veterinary pathologist who was just walking down the hall one day and saw a poster of this disease, and he said, why there? Why does it cause this lesion in the spinal column of a chicken? It just doesn't, it's not typical, right? So if you think about a pathogen that is part of your dominant like commensal gut microflora that's able to leave your gut and cause a disease, a paralytic disease that's not curable somewhere outside of your gut, it's pretty terrifying. So
that was the exact word that was in my head, was terrifying.
Yeah, it is just really horrible because the paralytic form of the disease happens near the end of production. And that's when there's been so much invested in a broiler chicken. And right before it goes to market, it either gets culled because it's paralyzed. And it's also a huge welfare concern because these birds can't get to feed or water. And that's kind of just another aspect of it that just makes it a horrible disease. So it came about in the United States in the 2000s. It was kind of an emerging disease then, and it's still causing problems today. What's interesting about it is, of course, the more we study these pathogens, the more we realize how much they change and how we can't really, it's like an arms race against them. Like they've already changed by the time we figure something out about them. And what we found is that, and mostly anecdotal evidence, but that the sepsis form of the disease is actually causing a lot of earlier mortality. So now it's the question of like, has the bug changed, or have the poultry changed? The host, we don't know, and we've got some projects looking at that, as well as just being able to diagnose it and isolate and diagnose this in the first place. Because, like I said, it's everywhere, and there are commensal and pathogenic strains. So part of our message is trying to find the pathogenic strains and where they're at, because again, Enterococcus cecorum is a dominant commensal of the poultry microbiota. So it's kind of hard.
Yeah. So do you have any developing recommendations maybe at the hatchery level, especially if it's in some of the embryos that stop development? Do you have any recommendations that would maybe be good for a hatchery to follow if you think one of the main causes is at the hatchery?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the ones I've been told and heard throughout the years is make sure you don't, because and I'm pretty far removed from the hatchery, like day-to-day things that go on in the hatchery. But I think of like an egg incubator. I think of it also like a bacteria incubator.
Yes.
And because that's what it is. It's a perfect temperature. It's the perfect humidity. Like, not only are you growing, chicks, but whatever bacteria are there, you're growing those too. So don't set floor eggs. Sometimes that's hard because, it's always a cost benefit analysis, right? And if you don't have enough eggs to set, you want to keep incubators full. So, sometimes you have to, but I think it starts with, what you put in that incubator, making sure it's as clean as possible. And then you can take that all the way back to the management of your breeders even, and like wet feces and problems that are associated with like floor eggs or surface contamination of eggs. And then, I think an important part is to remove unviable embryos as soon as possible. And, that may or may not be practical. I understand, like in thousands and thousands of eggs situation, but as I understand it, there's technology that allows you to discern like non-viable embryos, and then those get thrown out at transfer, during vaccination at transfer. So because I think of these as like ticking time bombs, because it's an egg that's a perfect medium to grow bacteria with the perfect conditions to grow bacteria. And if the egg itself is contaminated, if the embryo died and is contaminated, then it can seed those pathogens to everything else. So it's kind of like an explosion going off in the hatchery. Is how in the hatching baskets is how I think of it. And I guess that's part of what we now know is like this horizontal transmission of a lot of these pathogens begins before the chicks even hit the floor at the farm. Yeah. So those are just some thoughts I have. Is it practical? Maybe not always, but I think we can get there, so it really comes down to sanitation and just being smart about contaminants that enter the incubator in the first place.
Yeah. So do you have any theories as to why this enteric pathogen or commensal, whichever version you're talking about, why it's leaving the gut, going elsewhere, and then coming back? Like, what do you think about that? It seems like an interesting trafficking pathway.
It is. The way I think about it is there's like a predisposing lesion in the bird that the bacterium likes, and that's this OCD, osteochondrosis dissecans lesion of the free thoracic vertebra. So not to get in the weeds here, but like the chicken has a fused spinal column except for certain free thoracic vertebra, and that's a spot that's really prone to getting an OCD lesion. And for some reason, I don't know, the bacteria come out of the blood and they really like that lesion there. And that's where they set up shop and make this huge abscess that compresses up on the spinal cord and causes the paralysis. So that's one of the magic ingredients of like the paralytic form of Enterococcus cecorum infections. As far as sepsis, I think a lot of those actually don't start in the gut per se, but they find some other portal of entry, be that the respiratory tract or yolk sac infections, I think are a big source of septicemic infections in poultry. So, and then that all goes back to cleanliness and sanitation when the chicks are as soon as the chicks hatch, right?
Yeah. So I know that you said there was an increase in the occurrence just of kinky back and some of these other things over time. Do you think that has to do with some of the regulations that are being put on hatcheries in terms of these birds are going to an organic flock, or these birds are, do you think some of those, the cleaners or the way we are able or not to treat different health conditions in birds has to do with some of these other issues arising?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest problems when you ask poultry veterinarians that they face in the industry, top of the list is always the lack of efficacious drugs to treat some of these diseases. Yeah. And of course, that's in response to a lot of regulatory pressure as we move out of this antibiotic era, more towards like the post-antibiotic era for pathogen control, which is, great in and of itself for different reasons, but it also makes solving the problems we have right now really difficult. Yeah. And I think the withdrawals and the restrictions on certain drugs is a problem. However, the other side of that is a lot of these pathogens are multi-drug resistant and resistant to the drugs that we've been using for years to treat them. So that's another issue. And yeah, I think that really contributes to the rise of these like if you have a small fire in a poultry house and you can't put it out, it's going to spread, right? Yeah. And then you get into trouble later on.
Yeah.
So, and from what I hear lately about and again, I don't know how touchy of a subject this is, but about like no antibiotics ever production is that it's really difficult to offer that at a price that consumers are willing to pay.
Yeah.
So, and again, I think of when I explain this to people, I try to talk about it like a balance. Like you have to balance the bird's health with us offering a product that's affordable for people, a protein source that's affordable. And that's true for a lot of the issues we're facing in the poultry industry right now.
Yeah. So as you're kind of moving through all of your degrees, has there been, I know we have certain opportunities when you're doing a PhD program, you kind of want to focus in on something because you want to graduate at some point and you can't just explore everything. But did anything ever pop up that was really of interest to you that you just didn't have time, to go explore just because you want to graduate someday?
I don't even know where to start because my mind's like constantly jumping around to like different things that interest me. I'd say the biggest thing is probably like the food safety side of things. I think that's really interesting. And that was like part of the puzzle I worked with in my master's degree, but I didn't spend a lot of time in that area. So that would be one of them. There are plenty of other pathogens that, I've worked with a little bit, but never really took hold. Campylobacter being one. Of course, that's more of a human pathogen, not necessarily a poultry pathogen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say on the food safety side of things, I enjoy like processing. I think that's an interesting process and be able to do something there that makes our food safer to consume, I think is really cool.
Yeah.
So that's the first one that comes to my mind.
So my group does a fair bit of work with some different pathogens, and I can appreciate some of the pathogens for the evasion techniques, that they've come up with, like upregulation of IL-10 or, some other things. But are there any pathogens that you've been working with that you think, wow, this really in the future could be a bigger problem than it is currently if we don't do something about it? It sounds like kinky back is on the list, right? Is there something else that we're not paying good enough attention to that from a veterinary standpoint just might not be on people's radar?
Well, again, I'm in the bacterial world, and so my mind goes to the issue of, and this is a giant can of worms, but I'm going to go ahead and open it, the issue of E. coli contamination and having these pathogenic E. coli in the food supply. Now, people will tell you different things regarding the transmission of E. coli from a food source to humans. I don't necessarily think it's been proven that that's occurred. And by proven, I mean like there's a disease in chickens caused by E. coli that gets transmitted through the food chain that causes a disease such as, probably the most famous one would be like a urinary tract infection in humans or some kind of sepsis in humans. I don't think that's been fully proven yet, but I think that's a risk. And, I guess to think about treating something that's like E. coli, like salmonella, I think that's way in the future, but it's possible.
So do you think from a regulatory standpoint, that's kind of where that needs to go, is more testing, more frequent testing, or?
Yeah, and it actually has gone that way. Whether people realize it or not, I suppose, is that one of the projects we work with at NC State is the Genome Tracker Network. And this is a project that is run through the FDA. And what they do is they just sequence pathogens from animal sources. And this could be like a food source, or there's also some projects through the FDA that just are involved with surveillance of retail meat, where we literally go out, purchase retail meat from different grocery stores across North Carolina and see what's there.
Yeah.
And a lot of these pathogens in quotation marks, because they may not actually be confirmed pathogens, but they're associated with, like, they're either E. coli, salmonella, or campylobacter, get sequenced and put in a repository. And that's so if there ever was an outbreak of human disease attributed to some kind of foodborne exposure, you would already have the sequence and being able to trace that back to where it came from. So, yeah, that's more on the surveillance side. The regulatory side, I'm not so sure of. I feel like regulation has more of a negative connotation than positive connotation in the poultry industry. But yeah, and I've been trying to kind of keep up over the years with salmonella being labeled as an adulterant and issues like that. And one of the issues with regulation is that I think you have to have the same rules apply to everyone across the board. So one particular company or entity doesn't get an unfair advantage. And I think that can be really hard. So that's just some challenges that come to my mind when I think about that and looking at the future.
So just a random question, because I don't actually know the answer. So you're doing surveillance. Are you targeting fresh products, like something that's not ever been frozen, or do they look at fresh, frozen, and then further processed? Like, everybody's favorite, obviously, dinosaur nuggets. Are they testing all sorts?
Yeah, and full disclosure, this is something run out of Dr. Sid Thacker's lab, who has been another mentor to me at the vet school. And he's the lab that runs this project. His lab just happens to be right next to ours. So there's a little bit of overlap. And it's kind of neat because we get a lot of poultry bacterial isolates, and they are always looking for more isolates to sequence to add to this database. So it's kind of been a good collaboration over the years. And as far as I know, it's mostly fresh products that they test, and not so much further processed products.
Yeah, that was my guess, but I thought maybe for some reason, because the way you're told to cook poultry is similar, right? For fresh versus frozen, and make sure it's not touching other stuff and don't wash it or whatever. But my guess was it should be fresh, but then I thought, well, I don't know. Maybe they're out there testing all the nuggets, so I don't know.
Sometimes I go peek over there on sampling days, and I've never seen any dinosaur nuggets on their lab bench yet. But
good. I don't want to know if anything's...
There haven't ever been any, but that would be interesting to look at the further process side of things.
It was my assumption that most salmonella or some of these foodborne pathogens, freezing them would probably be detrimental, but I guess then again, I don't know, maybe there are some that are resistant to freezing.
Yeah. I mean, the way my lab mind thinks about it is the way we preserve bacteria in the lab is either stick them in a -20 or a -80 degree freezer.
Yeah.
Or, so
we're also nice to them though. So who knows?
Yeah, true. Add a lot of, like it's in a broth media, but yeah. So, I don't know how bactericidal freezing is. I think of that as more of a bacteriostatic thing.
Yeah, that's definitely fair point. Fair point. So as you're looking to kind of finish your veterinary degree and move on, what do you think? What are your next steps? Are you thinking you want to combine the vet and the research, or do you want to go to more diagnostics? Like, where do you go with a cool degree like this? I
am going to the United States Department of Agriculture.
Oh, awesome.
And I could not be more excited about it. So it's kind of interesting. I've done poultry all along, and I hope to still be involved in poultry, but where I'll be is the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab with USDA APHIS. So for those who don't know, they're in the process of a big move right now. It's been historically located at Plum Island in New York, and now they're moving to Manhattan, Kansas with the National Bio and Agri Defense Facility. So I was actually part of a fellowship program that funds my degree program in exchange for a service commitment after I'm done. I say service commitment. I don't think of it as a commitment. I think of it was my dream job. Like, I've always been interested in, what pathogens are out there and surveillance and diagnostics. So that's where I'm heading. Of course, the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab deals with, our main concern is like foot and mouth disease and African classical swine fever. So it's a little bit different. Those are not diseases of poultry for anyone who doesn't know. But also, like, the high path avian influenza is a huge problem, ongoing. It was horrible last year, and everybody seems to kind of be like anxiously waiting to see what new things that's going to bring. But we're coming out of the worst outbreak that we can remember. So, but that testing actually isn't done through the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab. That's done in Ames, Iowa. So.
Heck yes, by a good friend of mine who is also watching the migratory patterns right now.
Yep. So that's where I'll be, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I'll be making the move to Manhattan, Kansas after I finish vet school next May to start my career with the USDA. So I think that's just a testament of you never know where it's going to take you. And that it can be, school or research or whatever. The possibilities are endless, and it's been a fun ride, and it's only just begun.
Yeah, gosh. Well, that does sound like a really cool dream job. So congrats in advance.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to becoming a Midwesterner.
Oh, yeah. Heck yeah. We're nice out here. Is there anything that we haven't covered today that you just wanted to emphasize or kind of conclude as we get to the end of the podcast?
I don't know. We've talked about a lot of dense stuff.
Yeah.
Like really good questions. And I'm afraid if I talk anymore that I'll be talking too much. But I can talk all day about pathogens and
forever.
Grace really started making the joke as like because people are in their camps, with poultry is like, oh, I'm in processing, or oh, I do broilers or layers or turkeys. And I'm like poultry agnostic. Like if it's a disease if it's a disease of poultry, I'm interested in it. So
I love that.
It's time for our famous 3. Natural Biologics is using cutting-edge science to dig deeper into the poultry health challenges you face. By gathering scientific evidence, they identify the most effective combinations of natural ingredients that improve animal health. Visit naturalbiologics.com/poultry to see the newest research in both turkeys and chickens.
So before we wrap up the end of the show, I want to ask you the 3 questions that we ask all of our guests. Our first question is, what is your favorite poultry resource?
My favorite poultry resource, I'll give, I guess, the more academic ones first, would be Diseases of Poultry. It just released a 2-volume set. That's a fantastic resource for all things poultry diseases. And then, of course, I'm always into Poultry Science and Journal of Applied Poultry Research. That being said, with the textbooks and the peer-reviewed literature, but I think while that's current, it's not as current as like what's going on right now, because as we know, things take forever to publish and whatnot. So honestly, my favorite poultry resource are my friends who are working in the industry. And it's kind of neat because here I am still in school, but all of the friends I made in graduate school are out in industry or academia and just doing some really cool stuff. And I know anytime I have a question about poultry, I go to them, and we usually try to meet as regularly as possible, even though we've kind of taken different paths in our careers or schooling in my case, and try to discuss like all the hot topics that are going on in the industry right now. So that's probably my favorite poultry resource, are the friends and colleagues that are also in this with me.
That's a great response.
Yeah.
Our second question is, what is a favorite non-poultry resource or book?
So lately I haven't had much time to do much like reading for pleasure, because it's all been prep for veterinary boards, which I take in a little over a month. But that's not like by any means my favorite non-poultry resource. That's just been like an obligation of mine lately. I don't know. I really like to eat, first of all. I love food, and I love to cook food, and I love to travel. So I recently read Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain. God rest his soul.
Yes.
And that was just a fantastic read that I joined up on the party way too late. But it had some really important life lessons scattered throughout this book that was almost entirely about food. It talked about the culture, the restaurant culture, and managing people, and playing part of as a team, and all these things. So I just think it was a beautiful, beautiful book to read. And I just finished that, and that was a blast. So that's a really good suggestion. I think I need to check that out. I've started texting other people who fellow foodies and people like that. I was like, "Have you read this?" Like, "Yeah, dude, I read that in high school." Well, I don't know how it's taken me this long to read it, but I kind of just want to start it over and read it again because it was awesome.
Yeah, gosh, do it, man. It sounds like a great book. So our last question of the day is, how would you tell somebody who wants to get into the poultry industry, any aspect of it, what's your best advice to be successful?
I think mine would be go to conferences. First and foremost, because they're fun, right? I've never had a bad time at any PSA or IPPE I've ever gone to, and I don't know of anybody else who's had a bad time there either. So, but it's just fun. It always feels like a big family reunion, and even as some of my things aren't as exactly poultry centered as I would like them to be nowadays, I still try to go to as many different conferences as I can to stay current on what's going on in the terms of research, to meet with people who I haven't seen in a while, or I'm separated by distance from. So that's just a blast. And as a graduate student, that always kept me on top of things with my own research, and helped me kind of progress through my degree programs. I thought it was intense when I was doing my master's degree with Dr. Brake. It was he made us submit at least one abstract to every major conference. And it's you're constantly trying to race, oh gosh, we have another abstract deadline coming up, and then got to give this oral presentation. But then it was cool because not only did it motivate me to get the data to write an abstract, right? But by the time it came time to summarize it all and defend, I already had most of my story that I had been giving all along
Yeah.
And it was already, in theory, peer reviewed because, I had presented it to a jury of my peers, as they say, at one of the conferences, and had it kind of evaluated and had a chance for questions. So that would be my advice for anybody who's doing a degree in poultry science or related fields, is to go to conferences, present, communicate your research. I think that's the most important part.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. This has been really fun and interesting.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me. I've had fun.
Yeah. I'm always excited to hear about other diseases that afflict poultry, especially when they're maybe up and coming. And I don't want to say up and coming because it's been around, but we're hearing about more of it.
Me too. Me too.
Thank you, and have a great afternoon.
You too. Thanks so much.